Anyone who's run in Chicago or in the Chicago Marathon knows it's really hard to get an accurate GPS tracing in the Chicago Loop. But today we're going to see how the Apple Watch, the Garmin Vivoactive 3, the iPhone in Strava, and the Under Armour FootPod do in getting that tracing. So to set out the parameters of this run, what I did was I ran 5 days this week, every day with one watch on each arm. I ran with the phone Bluetooth off, so that way the iPhone wasn't helping either the Garmin watch or the Apple Watch Series 4. I'm thinking mainly for the Apple Watch Series 4. And then I also had the Under Armour Hovr CGR, which I've been running in. The FootPod's kind of like magic. You don't have to turn it on. You don't have to sync it to anything. You just start running and it knows and can detect when you started running. There's no battery to plug in or charge. It just kind of just goes. And then after you're done with the run, you can kind of connect your phone. I would turn Bluetooth back on and connect the phone to the shoe, and then it would pull data from it. I don't get a GPS tracing from it because it's a FootPod, but it can calculate stride length, cadence, and also distance. And so I thought that was really interesting. The first thing that I did was I tried to run the same exact run commute every day this week. And for the most part, I was able to do that fairly well, I think. There was one day where the waves and the winds were really crazy and I had to kind of weave to avoid getting soaked with like freezing water on my feet. Even though I do like running through water, getting soaked with ice water from the lake is not my idea of a good time, even in the name of pseudoscience like we've got going on here. It's not very scientific. It's just 5 data points. But I'll put on the screen the data points that I've gotten so far. I've said that I did it 5 days in a row. The first day's data I'm going to kind of toss out for the watches and for the phone. And the reason for that is I tried to get to a spot where it would be a little bit more forgiving for the watches, and also to try to inject more consistency in terms of pace. And that's because where my office is a couple blocks from where the Riverwalk starts in the Chicago Loop. And there, on that part, at the end of the day, there's frequent stops that I have to make. So I'm starting and stopping. I didn't want to have to start and stop 3 different devices every time I had to stop at a stoplight. And I don't like auto pause. I never turn auto pause on because different devices have different levels of aggressiveness or not aggressive enoughness. So I thought to make it simple, I would start at the same spot every day, a couple blocks away from my office, where I knew I would no longer have any traffic to deal with in terms of stoplights. But it turns out that because this shoe, there's no on or off switch to it, it detected when I started getting to the start point, and I didn't realize that, didn't think that one through. But after the first day, then the second day, I just started from right outside my office. I would wait for the GPS to lock in on the Garmin watch, which a lot of times took a really long time because right outside my office, I'm like underneath train tracks by lots of tall office buildings. And I also had the Nike watch, the Nike app on the Apple Watch set, kind of waiting. So that way it would hopefully start realizing, hey, GPS needs to kind of kick in and lock in on a signal too. And I was hoping that would help. Same thing with the iPhone and using Strava. This is an iPhone 7, by the way, and using Strava. Wi-Fi was on, Bluetooth was off. And so just to give kind of the basic parameters of the setup. And taking a look at some of the tracings, let me first look. I'll show you the Map My Run tracing, which I use as control. Now, I know that every day I ran slightly different. There's no way you can exactly run the exact same route every day because there's people along the Riverwalk, there's weather conditions, there's just natural variation. But I used the same one map tracing that I made, that I personally generated, and fortunately, the Riverwalk and the trail that I run on are all marked in the maps that Map My Run has. And so for the most part, there was only 2 really small parts where I had to kind of not there's an option you can check to like set it to trace the route or stick to the road, like make it sticky to the road or whatever routes it has available to it. There's only two little spots where I had to do something different, where I kind of meander a little bit, or where I think the actual map looks different than what I run. And so there was only two little spots for that. I think negligible amounts. If I had left them in under the defaults of making it sticky to the trail route, I think it would have been fine as well. But for that, I got 6.46 miles. And let's take a look at the tracing. The most difficult part of the tracing, and where I saw most variance, was of course in the loop, where I think it's a torture test, right? And so I'm on the Riverwalk, which is 2 or 3 levels below like the grade, or where the surface street is, or what we call Upper Wacker Drive in Chicago. There's Upper Wacker Drive, there's Lower Wacker Drive, and then the Riverwalk is below it. And then there's certain parts of the Riverwalk where the 3 levels of it are really obvious, where there's Upper Wacker Drive, a Lower Wacker Drive, and then you could see 3 different layers of street. A lot of other times it's like behind concrete and things like that, so you can't see it. But it's definitely 2 layers below grade, along a river, under a lot of bridges, and it meanders. So a lot of very small, minute meanderings. And so it's going to be really tough for watches, I think, to be able to pick that up, or at least consumer grade GPS devices. I say consumer grade because that's my way, I think, of giving it a pass. I don't know what non-consumer grade GPS is like, so I'm just kind of throwing that out there, with the assumption that there is another level of GPS that perhaps the military uses. I don't have access to that. I have access to these. The one thing that I'll kind of point out as we go forward, as a bit of foreshadowing, is as we go along the Riverwalk, it's very jagged. And that's, I think, an accurate representation of what I'm running. And that's because the Riverwalk hugs kind of some of the walls, and the way that the Riverwalk has been designed it's not like a complete straight shot. And so it naturally, or not naturally, but it curves. And so I think that like the meanderings of it, that's all accurate. So first, let's take a look, and these are in no particular order. Let's look at here's what the Strava tracing looks like, and they all kind of look the same. There's some variation in distance over the week, but I used Friday's or yesterday's tracing as just kind of the exemplar to show you kind of what each app is doing, but they all generally look the same. If anyone's super curious about that, I can send you screenshots of all the other stuff, because the data, it's all there. So, but here's what Friday's tracing looked like. I thought it did a relatively good job. Let's take a closer look. This is the area that I think is the most difficult. And you can see Randolph and Wells is usually about where I start my run commute. And it's just a straight shot. I don't cross the street. I just go straight down. Sometimes I cross the street naturally, but for the purpose of this test, I just ran straight down the street until I got to Wacker, and then I went north. But here it shows me kind of doing a whole bunch of stuff. Not ultimately, though, not too bad. And then I think it did a relatively good job of tracing the natural, or tracing the actual path, how it waves in and out along the Riverwalk. The next one we'll take a look at is the Nike. The Nike one this tracing is coming from the watch, and this one, it's interesting because the Nike watch, across all the different tracings that I looked at, that super high problem area right outside my office was the most variable of all the devices, was the Nike watch. And I'm guessing it's because it's not doing the GPS lock thing that the Garmin watch does. I think it just kind of like starts. It's very Apple. You don't get to know how it starts or how it works. You're just supposed to trust it. Let's take a look at kind of the close-up. And you could see it starts me off half a block away, and then has me running through buildings, doubling back, and then crossing the street and crossing back, crossing the street multiple times as I go up Wacker, and then finally get to the Riverwalk. And then it does an okay job. It's doing a lot of smoothing, it looks like. I think it's taking some of those data points where I'm coming in and out and thinking that those are variability points, and it's trying to smooth it out a little bit. So I think that's kind of what's happening. And then we'll take a look at the Garmin, the Vivoactive 3. This is the tracing that it got. It looks okay. Pretty similar to the Nike watch, though, which was a surprise to me. I thought this would be much more specific. And if we take a look at just Fridays, this starts me half a block south. I would spend a good a solid 30 seconds. It doesn't sound like that long, but like stand outside in 30 degree weather for 30 seconds with both gloves off, because you need to start all these devices, and 30 seconds you realize how long that is. It still started me off half a block away from my office, and then it really had me loop far. And so it had me going all sorts of different ways. And then it did an okay job, but still pretty loose and far away from the actual kind of way that the river walk, in at least that part of the loop, kind of meanders around. And so I think that the one that was closest was mind-blowingly, it was the iPhone. And the whole reason I got into smartwatches at all was because I found that using Strava and the iPhone was a completely, not completely, but a really unreliable method of tracking my run. So this data is kind of blowing my mind here. Let me give you a shot of just tracing it out. The real thick line that's on here is the map my run, and I know that that's also an estimation, even though I've gone through on a map and plotted points. I'm estimating that every day I ran the same thing because I don't know if I was on the left side of the trail, the right side of the trail, if I had to move to run out of the way of a wave. Like, I don't know that stuff. I suspect that on Wednesday, that's why everyone's up a little bit. All the devices except for the Apple Watch are higher than the normal. And so I think that's the day that we had those high winds and it was super crazy out because everything's a little bit elevated there compared to the baseline map my run estimation. So that's kind of the control, or the most control-ish data point that I have. And then everything else you can kind of see there. All of the three of the devices, the two watches and the phone only have 4 data points. The shoes have 5 data points. And then the other thing that's crazy about this is that the FootPod is the most accurate in terms of actual distance. It was about 0.04 or 0.05 miles off from the map my run distance every day, which I think is like a 0.006% level of inaccuracy, and it tended to underestimate the distance, which is, I would rather it underestimate the distance than overestimate the distance. I don't know if that's statistically significant, and I didn't do any analysis to see if there was any outliers that needed to be removed. I'm just looking at the bald numbers, doing some arithmetic, not any statistics, not any hardcore statistics. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. The FootPod ended up being the most accurate for this run on those days, which is a surprise to me. Although, in another sense, not that much of a surprise for me because it's the one that's not GPS based. And so it's not going to have any of the difficulty that the watches and the phone would have because they're in like a torture chamber in terms of trying to get a GPS signal 2 levels below grade in a series of urban canyons and under bridges. But the thing that surprised me the most was how close the Vivoactive 3 and the Apple smartwatch were, at least according to my small sample set. So that's the data. I'm really quite surprised by it. All these devices did relatively well. I think they all provided a pretty good tracing. The real surprise was the iPhone. I haven't compared the paces that it's given me, and that's because of the pausing issue that I didn't want to deal with. And also I did run about the same pace every day, I think, in like the 840s is what I was running. But the biggest variability would have been in that couple of blocks, maybe like a little less than a half a mile between where my office is and where the start point that I tried to create is. That's where I have the most variability in terms of how fast I'm able to run, because sometimes I'd have to wait for 1 light, sometimes I'd have to wait for 2 or even 3. And so usually it was around 2 lights that I would have to wait for. And so that created a lot of problems. And I was also, to get down to the Riverwalk, I have to loop back, go down a set of stairs, and that's also going to be weird for pacing as well. So I guess there's more research to be done. I'm not all that interested in doing it. I'd like to kind of spread the wealth and run in some other different shoes a little bit. Running in the Hovr has been interesting all week. But I've got a whole bunch of other shoes in my closet, like the Vomero and the Beacon, that I'm really excited to also mix it up with. I mean, I've run in the same shoe for like 10 days straight before, but I've got a lot of other shoes that I really want to get some more miles into. So that's what will be coming up next week. So I am looking forward to that. But that's the data for today. Yeah. I think ultimately my general premise for all these devices still holds, is whatever you're using, as long as it's like it's that difference between precision and accuracy. As long as it's precise, as long as you're getting the same runs are giving you the same types of data or the same results, as long as things are repeatable, I think that's great. If it's completely accurate, I'm less concerned. If it's going to be wrong, I wish it would underestimate rather than overestimate, so that way when I show up to the line on race day, I'm not thinking I can run a certain pace when in fact I've been running much slower this whole time. So I don't want to do that. Those are kind of like general things that I would want. But for the most part, all these did relatively close to each other, which is consistent with the kind of like the softball that I threw at these devices earlier when we did the analysis of these same devices, granted over a couple of different days and periods, but the same thing in an absolutely open air area in a rural area where there was no GPS interference or even Wi-Fi interference at all. So it's interesting that it's consistent in both, and promising. I'm glad to see that, and very excited. Before I go for today, I want to talk about today's charity runner. Today's charity runner for the day is Craig Barstow. He's going to be running the 2019 London Marathon for Bliss, which is a UK-based charity that supports premature or sick babies. Craig chose this charity specifically because he has his own personal experience with premature births. His grandson was born 15 weeks early, and they went through quite an ordeal just to be able to bring that baby home. And so he's trying to give back and run for an organization that can provide support for other families who are going through a similar situation. So I've donated £5 to his fundraising campaign, and I'll put a link in the description in case you want to consider joining me and helping premature babies and their families. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Yo, what's going on?